Thank you very much, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. We are now getting ready for the rest of the program. I can't interrupt this conversation. We will now move on to the next session, one of the last sessions of the Herzliya Conference 2018, talking about the challenges of the future and the decision-making processes. I would like to ask everyone to please take their seats. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to present the next session that talks about the challenges of the future and decision-making processes. It will be moderated by Ms. Tallie Lipkin-Shahak, and I am honored to give her the floor. Can we turn on the lights? Good afternoon. The lights will keep us awake. We have an enormous challenge that is especially challenging in these unclear times to talk today about the challenges of the future, about visions, about decision-making, not because we do not face any challenges, but rather because of the many challenges, their diversity, and the very tight schedule, the very quick, rapid pace in which they develop. And we want to present the team, the panelists who will discuss this very complex topic, challenge of the future, from the decision-making process perspective. I hope that the stage will be illuminated just like the auditorium. We will call them one at a time. Former head of the National Security Council and National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, President of Boeing Israel, also former Director General of the Ministry of Defense, Major General David Ivry, Major General Amos, Professor Uzi Arad, Professor Yaakov Nagel, former head of the National Security Headquarters and the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Faculty of Aerospace and Engineering at the Technion, and Mr. Chagai Tzuriel, who has been in the Ministry of Intelligence for many years. He represented the Mossad in the United States, currently the Director General of the Ministry of Intelligence. I will come sit with you.
We will now be asking over the next 45 minutes, or however long we have left, what is the method through which strategic decisions are being made in order to put to practice this strategic vision? And we'll try to define that vision that Israel should be embracing at its 70th anniversary for the next 70 years or 100 years. And from your experience in the various positions that I have mentioned, we have 3 heads of council / headquarters, because the council became a headquarters. And you can attest to the decision-making process. And last but not least will be the current Director General of the Ministry of Intelligence, headed by the Minister Israel Katz, who will be able to talk about current affairs in this day and age, and how, in face of multiple challenges in an ever-changing reality, we are focusing on and creating a decision-making process that will impact the next 70 or 700 years. So, David Ivry, you'll be the first to speak, and I'd like to ask you, based on your experience then and what you see now, is there a method, a sort of a policy for defining a vision or putting it to practice? I would like to speak about two methods. The first, how to achieve Israel's supreme strategy, and the second, how to manage the campaign, which is together with the National Security Council. We have to ask whether we can find a process to either get what's possible or attain what is desirable. And usually you want to attain the desirable, but sometimes that's impossible. And therefore, perhaps we should have a method for attaining the possible and then slowly but surely, gradually reaching the desirable. And you'll be able to understand a little more when I give an example. Many leaders wanted to have a security concept. Everyone has set up teams, very high quality teams, and I think the products to a certain extent were also a very good quality, but yet we don't have a security view or a security perception. And then every minister says, I don't have a perception, so let's set up a team, and we still don't have one. And the question is why? Because we are looking for the desirable rather than what is possible. And I'll tell you why. It is a coalition regime. And the coalition regime cannot reach consensus over basic principles, such as borders, religion, and state. And therefore you must compromise. Compromise is what's possible. The Prime Minister usually won't destabilize the coalition by bringing in a security view that is unacceptable to some of the coalition members, and therefore we have yet to find or consolidate such a vision. And so what should we do? We should look for a security view that is a compromise, one that the coalition at any given moment can accept, and then improve it when the opportunity arises. And that way we will have a product, a document, or an official outlook, a security outlook. And I can give you also the same for the designation of the State of Israel. The strategic designation should be, we have lost our strategic designation, where all is lost. Well, let's leave it for now. The strategic designation, let's leave it for now. You can get back to it. But the topic is as follows. Let's say borders. I can agree on safe borders, but I cannot agree on the fruit thereof. And there are some areas where that we can reach under the current coalition. Now, please note that demographics in Israel is forever changing. And what we can obtain today, we may not be able to attain in 20 years' time because it may not be the same. Therefore, the possibility of reaching a security outlook that may be a compromise, but at least it gives me what's possible, that will be the method that gives us this. And as for managing the campaign, and I'm trying to be very succinct here. Look, the regular method says the state, or in a democracy, the political echelon is the sovereign to decide, or for the army, what the goals of war are, what the objectives are. And then the army prepares a war plan. You look through it, you make sure it is appropriate, and then the army carries it out. Now, things have changed. They have become more complex. We have the wars between wars. And then the National Security Council comes in, and that's its job when I set it up. And I will explain. What do we want in a war? I mean, war is military means that are an extension of political ones, as Clanchton said. So the political echelon is the sovereign, and the army has to provide an answer and listen to what I'm saying, because usually we are still engaged in looking for a victory, for a military goal, but a victory is not always good. I will give you some examples very briefly. The victory in the Six-Day War created polarization in the Middle East. The victory in the Yom Kippur War brought us the peace with Egypt. And pay attention to what I've said, and I don't want to go into detail. The Second Lebanon War, was there a military victory? There's a disagreement around that. But who won? Hezbollah, because they attained a political goal. They are now the rulers of Lebanon. And what they say is what they do. It's because they don't want to lose this political achievement. So what am I trying to say? Political deterrence is more important than military deterrence. If they are going to lose a political goal, they wouldn't want to get mixed up with our army. Not because we won the war. They had other reasons when they were involved with Syria and Hezbollah. But victory isn't always identical to the political goal, and therefore we have to define political goals very carefully. And in decision-making processes today, when you're in the campaign between campaigns or the war between wars, military victory does not always give you a political edge. And therefore, each and every day we must have a discussion and decide whether the political situation is getting better or worse. If it's getting worse, stop the war, because at any rate there will be no victory, no decisiveness. Moreover, we can change political goals during the war if new issues arise and emerge. Let's say we hit Kfar Kana and we say, okay, if we are losing this goal, we have to set new ones. The decision-making process today must change and not force us, because each and every day we needed to test ourselves to ensure that we attain political goals and not military ones. Each and every day we have to make sure that our political situation is getting better, because if it's getting worse, you should stop the campaign. Those who stop first lose the least. Okay, so the next question touches upon the National Security Council, which you once headed. What is the role that it should be playing? Well, the political echelon should be deciding on the goals, and it's not always so, because sometimes it is the IDF that suggests the goal, and then the IDF prepares the plan. And the National Security Council needs to check whether the plan doesn't have an impact on other things like tourism or the economy. Of course, when you have an operation exactly when a president of a certain country comes, it's not the right time to do it. And the National Security Council has to have a broader perspective to see what would be the impact of a military operation on the political situation. And they should make comments. Sometimes its remarks are accepted by the political echelon, and we say to the IDF, change your plan. Sometimes the military plan itself maybe has greater damage embedded in it. And so the army will prepare the plan, will prepare a different plan according to what the National Security Council says. The National Security Council cannot prepare the plan. Maybe some people think that it does, but it doesn't have the responsibility, and they're not going to go to the funerals later. Those who go to the funerals later are the army. So the National Security Council can only remark upon the broader aspect, and the IDF must therefore change their plans, correct their plans, and come back. Then afterwards, during the war, the National Security Council must help the government examine whether the political situation is getting better or worse. Do you need to change the political objectives of the campaign at this point or not, and make such proposals to the government? If the government accepts these proposals, then the IDF needs to make plans accordingly. So it constantly has this staff work in order to help the government instruct the IDF properly and to see how this impacts tourism, the economy, and some such. Okay. Uzi Arad, what David Ivry is describing, at least through the prism of the National Security Council, is a role not in the vision or in the campaign that is supposed to meet the demands of the future or the challenges of the future, but rather in managing the daily campaign, it is lacking, or so it seems to me, the long-term vision component. Is there a long-term vision component in what you're describing? Does the National Security Council see before it a long-term vision, and according to it, it provides answers or response to the daily, more tactical steps? Well, I talked about two areas: managing the campaign, and in fact, the National Security Council has a much broader task, and it sees whether the Ministry of Transportation's plan doesn't maybe put something that the Ministry of Tourism is doing in harm's way. So it has to be of a higher, broader perspective. Moreover, it can also direct or instruct long-term plans in various ministries and the integration between them, and somebody has to integrate and coordinate between them because each side has their own directions. So the matter of integration is one of the key components in the role of the National Security Council. Thank you very much. Arad. A state's strategy, which at times, as it appears on the highest level and available, which we sometimes call a supreme strategy or a multi-strategy, and we call it meta-strategy or grand strategy. There are various names for it. That is the highest level, and it is one level higher than what has been presented as the security vision, because the security vision as presented is more focused on the political military aspect and involves primarily security-oriented elements. But the state is more than just security, because as you will see, and as we once asked 20 very experienced people the following question: what are the key problems that may threaten the existence of Israel as a functioning state? Meaning, security here relates to the actual survival and existence of Israel as a functioning state. And you say, since existence is the supreme interest, then what are the problems at any given moment? Are there this kind of problems, that kind of problems, that in their current manifestation or development may shake the state to the point of undermining it and maybe even making it collapse? And then it appeared that the respondents, all of whom were very experienced people with very respectable bios, and the video, one of them, said what problems are possible. And wonder of wonders, of the 6 or 8, 4 were interior problems, internal ones, not the Iranian threat. Of course, the Iranian threat was among the most external, most strategic external threats. And it wasn't even other standard threats that were talked about. What was fascinating was that at a similarly severe level, meaning how detrimental the effect would be to the state of Israel, were internal issues, such as the divides and inequality in Israeli society. Another example, losing the quality advantages due to all sorts of organizational and infrastructural issues that will take away the quality edge of Israel that is embedded in its economic and military related edge. And it has nothing to do with Abu Mazen or the Mufti or the Iranians. It is us within ourselves. There are processes here, the severity of which existentially are no lower than security. And in order to prove this, the head of the National Security Council, who came after David Ivry, Uzi Dayan, when he reached this position, he had filled a very similar position to you. He was the Deputy General Chief of Staff. He was a minister and so on. And when he was sitting as the head of the National Security Council, he said, ironically, the gaps in Israel and the inequality in Israel are an existential threat that is more severe than the Iranian one. Okay, when you hear a statement such as that, first of all, you ask, how do you measure it? What kind of scales do you use What do you put on one side of the balance and the other? Well, it's a matter of worldview. Yes, it's not a matter of measurement but worldview, but it's an interesting statement. And what am I saying? I'm saying that today, when you need to talk about national strategy is the sum of all national strategies that have to grapple with either the goals or objectives of the vision, or if you use the planning method of SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities, then strengths are usually correctly identifying the strengths of your own system. That's done one way. The weaknesses is exactly the same, but the opposite. The weaknesses, the Achilles heels, what you fall from. Combat horses or fighter horses fell because of a small nail. The opportunities are already an assessment of the future. What are the opportunities in terms of your interests? And the threats, as we said before, is what are the threats that can come from outside or inside that may topple you existentially. And identifying each and every one of these sort of squares in the matrix has different methods. Identifying strengths you can do even through a ranking system or through the Delphi system. Identifying, for example, the threats and the opportunities, that is the risk management method. There are all sorts of trajectory and forecasting methods. But pay attention that intelligence is a key component here. You are supposed, at least in the sense of the external threat, to rely on what your intelligence tells you, because that is the most cardinal collection method to discover who is thinking bad thoughts about you, who is planning to do things against you, because threats are happening to you externally without anyone, because internal threats are threats that are done without anyone trying to harm you, but external threats is someone who is trying to undermine you intentionally while promoting their own interests. And that is a very tough strategy. And by the way, the system overcomes this problem either by using simulations or war games or all sorts of gaming processes. Uzi, you are defining and illustrating the way that we grapple with challenges such as tension. But what about vision? Well, I don't like the word vision. It's not me, it's them. They decided what I should talk about. Well, it's in fashion now. It's fashionable these days. You know that any company that doesn't have a credo, it isn't seen. And if you have a toilet paper making company, what is your credo? They are saying in order to purify the atmosphere and for social hygiene. But a vision is just trying to tell people, okay, we can change the world. So let's talk about future objectives. And when President Bush was told that vision isn't a fashion, so he said, I'm not into this vision thing. So is this a presentation or what David called the desirable and what we would like to attain, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel? That is one possibility. And then the question is, how do you define what is desirable? But I want to tell you about what's happening in Israel. Okay, you're defining the desirable through the possible. No, not necessarily. That depends. Look, when David talked, he's talking from his experience. That's his method, that's his style. He was always like that. He's a manager, he is very controlled, and he's not going to let his imagination go wild. Well, 1,000 miles begin with a single step. So many people feel the same way, but we have a person like Shimon Peres who was getting better the more his vision became more and more abstract and talked about a new Middle East. And yes, of course, it wasn't exactly the kind of new we are seeing now, but let's assume that we do need a goal, an objective, where we want to see the state in the future. So what's happened in Israel? Because 4 times groups have been required to do that. The first time was the group called Israeli Socioeconomic 2020.
זה היה צריכה להיות תוכנית, טווח ארוך.
At At a certain point, that was supposed to be the long-term plan, and they were asked, what kind of Israel do we want? And they got stuck, and for a few days they tried to delineate the Israel that they were looking for, and they decided it was Israel under the same attributes as in the Scroll of Declaration, in the Declaration of Independence, but they needed a goal that was too abstract, so they said the objective is that in 2028, Israel will be ranked number 15 in terms of product per capita. And they chose a very interesting rating that wants to upgrade Israel in terms of leadership. Another group called Retzuat put together 200 people, and they invented the term 15-15. They decided that within 15 years, Israel should reach the same rank, 15. Number 15 on the list, but this time in terms of the Index of Quality of Life by the World Bank. Some people know about this. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, in 2010, stood before one of these forums and said as follows: we are already heading in this direction, that we will be, guess what, number 15 in GDP per capita. He didn't say how soon or within what time frame. And this is very interesting. And also this style of setting goals by saying that in the constitutional value-based aspect, we don't touch upon this, but in numbers we want to go up. And why 15? Because that is the OECD average. The OECD average is somewhere in the 17, 18. So somehow, when it came to groups being set up, including leaders who had to provide a benchmark where we want Israel to be upgraded to because it's not there yet, they decided that the goal should be number 15 on the list. And I'm adding that in some things we're above the 15th. In the index of wealth, the index of happiness, we are number 11, and in security burden per capita, and we are the most moral army in the world, and it's self-declared, so don't believe it, but you can believe the first. And in some areas, we really are leaders. The problem is that Israel is in an asymmetric situation, and that is actually characteristic of our strategic national vision, whereby we have not just strengths but very clear weaknesses. We are in the 30s and 40s in some rankings, and I'll give you a hint as to the area. The governance, the government in Israel, in terms of the efficacy of its conduct, is ranked by various indexes around the world very low. And since there is an interaction between the two, you cannot promote a military or political goal if the engine of public service is lagging behind. Therefore, Israel's strategic outlook takes us back to SWOT, mapping strengths and strengthening them, mapping weaknesses and correcting them, making them at least the OECD average, correctly identifying the opportunities internally, because that's up to us, but also externally as much as we can, and to identify the threats, most of all, including the threat of inequality, which everyone agrees is a true threat to the national structure, and national strategy is therefore the integral of all affiliations and interactions between the political, social, technological, scientific, military, and so on. At the end of the day, you're both saying the same thing, and I'll just give a title to what you said. We need leaders. Yaakov, Nagel, I can see that you already want to respond.
I'd like to go back to what we defined as the purpose of this panel. I didn't plan to speak about the military security doctrine, but after David Ivry said what he said, I cannot but completely agree with him. There was a round table this morning. As the youngest member, at least in the time since he was the head of the National Security Council, I am completely convinced that a security doctrine that is endorsed by the cabinet because of the inherent things that he prevented, that will probably not happen. And it's not just because of all the groups that try
tried to define a doctrine and wrote some very fine documents in some cases. They have no chance of coming to say it, not because it's a bad thing, but because you cannot disconnect a security doctrine unless you go to places so that no one can understand. You cannot disconnect it from a coalition, from politics, from other aspects that even in a coalition, I think there's no chances of arriving at anything. So you have to define, not call it a security doctrine. Cabinet, government, the prime minister can define it, and on it he can build, without it being officially endorsed. And I'd like to get into things that are related to how decisions are made regarding. It's good to have a paper like a botanical guide that tells you what you're going to do. You don't need to have it endorsed and say this is the security doctrine of the state of Israel. And I can tell you that in the National Security Council there is someone who's in charge of that. But I want to make it clear what you're saying is that the cabinet, the government, and the prime minister will define it. But no, I didn't say that. No, I said that somebody needs to define it. The cabinet won't vote on what the security doctrine is. They need to, of course, examine the things in light. Each of one might have his own approach as he understands it. I would like to get into the decision-making process, some of which these are things that I dealt with, and there are some question marks on what I say and some exclamation points. We need to define exactly what the role of the National Security Council is, the Knesset, the committees, the subcommittees, the classified committees, the coalition, the opposition. And of course there is a reciprocal impact and interaction between the various decision makers in economics and in health and social welfare and so on and so forth. There's of course mutual influence, but I would like to explain how the decision-making process works. Yes, I'm the newest one in the National Security Council, so naturally I think that with all the criticism, the decision-making process is not bad at all, despite the fact that some of those entities that criticize the government and the National Security Council, they don't allow themselves to be confused by the facts, no matter what happens, especially regarding Iran and the nuclear program and the amazing exposure of the archive. But some of the people don't allow themselves to be confused by the facts. Let me give you one example. Building a work plan for the IDF, for the security and intelligence community, that is part of the decision-making process, of course, and something that the NSC and the cabinet work on a lot. No one would argue that's an inherent and important part of the long-term, short-term, mid-term decision-making process. I could also talk about decision-making in the health process, in education, and other areas. But sadly, and I agree with Ivry, that this is part of the role of the NSC, but these are there. The decision-making is much less orderly, although the criticism is levied on the security system because that's the easiest for them. And in some of the other areas, there is no decision-making process, so you can't even criticize it, of course, although there are problems there. But who decides what the goals, the security goals are, the strategy, the priorities, if we've met our goals or not, the role of the Defense Ministry, the Army, the NSC, the Cabinet? And here is the central question, and I'd like to answer it. Do the people building the program, whether it's the IDF or the Mossad or the NSA or anyone else, do they expect or want to be told what they need to achieve, or is it left to them just how to achieve it? Because of course they're the ones who know how to do it, and the NSC doesn't need to prepare the plan, but it needs to review the plan. And will they then authorize the plan according to the directives, or do they expect this process is only good if it determines what needs to be done is what they want to be done? But if it decides something they don't want to be done, then the process local influence in many areas. I said, for example, economics and politics, and it's very difficult to synchronize all these things. That is explicitly one of the roles of the NSC. And everyone, of course, has their own agenda. The Minister of Education, of Welfare, Health, and so on. Everyone wants to maximize what they have in their ministry. But the role of the NSC as the Prime Minister's right hand is to recommend and synchronize, and it does a pretty good job in terms of security. And I don't want to talk about myself, but let me just give you one example that's already been made public so I can talk about it. We'd like to have an example that hasn't been made public. I don't think in 2016-17, I don't know if that was the first time, the cabinet, in a series of very long discussions, decided on directives for targets to be achieved in each of the different fronts. And there are papers, they're of course classified. And this is the directive. This is what is required to be obtained in the north and the south and so on and so forth. There is such a directive, and that directive is given to the security level, and they have to come back and show their results. And ultimately, it has to come to the Knesset, and you have to vote on your national budget and security budget. And sometimes there are discrepancies between the directives and how they will be implemented, but it is the NSC that is the one that needs to do that. And some is decided that the NSC wasn't even a part of determining the directives and the work plan. And it doesn't matter how many papers were prepared and what this one said, and they continue to say that, including statements that this was synchronized with the security system. Those statements, for the most part, talked about the NSC, but the NSC was never asked to express its opinion on those things. But I can tell you, to sum up, because we don't have much time, I'm talking about
שכולם הסכימו איתי, ואני אומר שמבחינת מצבה
the strategic situation of the state of Israel. You know, with tactics, you can always argue, or was he decided on things that were number 1, number 15, or whatever. I think in general terms, Israel's strategic situation, including the events of the past few weeks, has never been better. There's a great deal that needs to be done, and we are facing some very serious challenges. And I do believe there will be a new nuclear agreement. We'll have a lot of work to do in advance of that, and Israel needs to make sure that whatever is done, it does not undermine or harm our security considerations. There are dangers, but Israel is strong, and we need to continue the development to the world, to Asia, to South America, the moderate Sunni countries. They must be part of the solutions. And all these things, while strictly holding to the principles of security. And we see what's been happening in the past few days and weeks. And therefore, I recommend, to sum up, to those who see things they don't always like, to try not to let themselves be confused by the facts and look at the facts. But there are facts, and I suggest not to confuse them.
הדברים שמנה הסעיפים או הרכיבים שמנה יעקב נגל.
The question is, has what Yaakov Nagel says is the result of some big plan, and now we are creating the ways to implement it, or are opportunities identified on the go, and then the right strategy is developed? The advantage, of course, is that you are a witness of what is happening, and the disadvantage is that you can't tell us what you know. You're a minister of the Ministry of Intelligence. You said that Iran can be an ally. Am I quoting correctly? Are you familiar with a statement of that nature? It's an idea. It was an ally Shah could come back to power.
והאם זו דוגמה טובה לאיזושהי מחשבה?
The question is, if we're thinking out of the box with a little bit, to take a little further look into the future, is that an option or an opportunity? First of all, further to what Nagel said, I would like to strengthen what he said. I thought about it a lot, and I said to myself, I think in the public, as Nagel hinted, there's a feeling that there's no decision-making process in Israel, there's no strategy or directives. And not just because in my job, but because I indeed know what I know and see what I see. There is a decision-making process, there is orderly staff work. It is done mainly in the IDF and in the intelligence branches and in the NSC. And there are examples, some very good examples of this work from the recent period. And by the way, for example, the matter of Iran and Syria, of Iran in Syria, there was a clear directive by the Prime Minister from quite a while ago. It's not even new, a very clear directive, and it was clear what needed to be done and what the purpose was, what the intention was, and staff work was done, and it was constantly updated in view of the facts on the ground in order to adapt the strategy to the constantly changing reality. Is there a directive about Gaza? What is it? There is one. There's a decision-making process. The subject is not the question of Israel's security doctrine. Let's go to the matter of decision-making. Another example of a place where there was excellent work done for over 10 years, between agencies and between organizations, interorganizational, and that's in the matter of the Iranian nuclear program, and that produced a lot of international achievements over those years. And there too, I think we need to give credit where credit is due. Is enough work done? Is there room for improvement? Of course there's room for improvement. Should we perhaps look even in the longer term? Yes. But is the work being done? Absolutely. I heard about challenges and decision-making processes, and I would like to talk about the decision-making process in view of the current challenges and those that will be with us for many years to come. General challenges, not specific ones. These challenges, as I see them, are the result of a number of megatrends that have a very strong influence on the decision makers as well as those below them and create extraordinary challenges. I will name 4 such trends. Number 1 is the change, of course, that we're all living in, the dizzying pace of the chronic instability that we must contend with, and the routine surprises, in quotes as it were, which as a result of that challenges the entire system, all the systems, and to remain relevant. That's the real challenge. And the second thing, which is a huge mega trend, it starts from the digital technological revolution. The third trend that impacts decision making as well as the training of people, that is the matter of interoperability and
אפקט הפרפר היה מטאפורה.
once the butterfly effect was just a metaphor, theoretical metaphor. And now things that were once on the margins are at the center of our attention. Once they were outside the focus, and the chances of things moving from the periphery of our attention to the center of our world maker must be familiar with a much wider area than in the past. And the third thing is the empowerment of non-state entities and groups. That means multinationals, corporations, not only terrorist organizations, but and that's in parallel to which the state continues to be a very strong player. And this has a very, very strong impact on the decision maker. The decision maker must contend simultaneously with all kinds of non-state or semi-state actors that you're familiar with. And at the same time, if you are following the American risk assessment documents, you can see that the understanding now is that after years of focusing on terrorist and sub-state threats, we now have to move the focus back to state threats. And the examples that are presented there, and it shouldn't come as any surprise, that's North Korea and Iran. We have to move our attention back to those state threats. The last thing that I think has an impact on the decision makers, and the decision maker isn't always a young person, someone who was born into this world of social media and the internet, and that is the blurring of the lines between the physical and virtual worlds. It's confusing, but it also embodies a lot of opportunities, and that's why it's important that around the decision makers, and they do this, they make sure, if you pay attention, you'll see there are always around them young people, talented young people who live in that current reality and know how to maneuver and negotiate this twilight zone between the physical and virtual worlds.
דבר אחד
Another thing that we need to contend with,
שבולט בעיניי של המציאות
and this is typical of what's happening now, and I want to give you a very good example of contending with this. That's the subject of the feature of reality, that this is a reality that is gray. It is not black or white. It is this and that, black and white. It's not friends or foes. It's of frenemies. In order to deal with that kind of reality, that you can cooperate with a certain party on one subject, but fight them bitterly on another subject. This example of frenemies, for example,
עולם כזה שצריך
and that we need to deal with them. It was behind the course of action, which we see after the fact was very, very important on the part of the Prime Minister. This dialogue with Russia as a fact on the ground, alongside, of course, the strategic alliance with the United States. Because our time is seemingly up, I would just like, I can just talk about staff work that I was involved with, two cases that, in my opinion, produced, in one case, excellent results, in another case, good results, perhaps could have been better. And that was reaching the aid agreement with the United States of $38 billion per decade, a large interministerial staff team from the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Defense, and so on and so forth. And it was not a simple matter for the NSC to lead that. There was a lot of criticism, but I think today everyone can see how important that was. And the second thing, something that was very classified and secret, but it was revealed after the nuclear agreement was signed. All the teams that worked on the nuclear project, and they explained why the agreement was bad. But if you're doing it, at least understand what it is that you do. Once again, a team that included almost all the relevant government ministries and worked in full synergy and visited all the important capitals in the world. There is excellent staff work that's being done. There's always room for improvement, and there's always more that can be done. But ultimately, we see you get results when you work properly and put everything on the table. If we had time, we would take the test case of the nuclear deal and see what was done according to what you said in an orderly fashion. And in one moment, as soon as no, this was not done in order to sign the agreement, but rather to explain those signing the agreement to impact what the agreement would look like. I understand, but there are work procedures, and ultimately there was an agreement, and as soon as there's a new president, the whole structure collapsed. As I said, it was good, but it could have been better. Chagai, I would like to add one thing that I was unable to say. If I were being asked now, in view of the crazy, constantly changing reality in which we live, what is one of the most important challenges of the decision makers today, in my opinion? One of the most difficult things is to make decisions today in force building because of the constantly changing reality and the constant technological revolution and new developments, how to guarantee our technological superiority. And this, of course, has implications for education and other areas, how to make decisions today that will guarantee superiority in the future. In my opinion, that is the number one challenge of the decision makers today. Give us one sentence, Uzi. Otherwise, they'll get mad at us. The challenges for all the agencies are even greater than what has been described here. And the very fact that staff work is being done and decision-making processes, the test is not whether they are carried out, but rather the result. In the test of the result, the challenge today is greater. And let me give you an example, but very briefly, please, because we've already gone over our time. Look, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the past 2 weeks, there has been a step up in the formulation of 2 people who are in charge of Israel's security, the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. The Prime Minister said more than once, he said the rule, he who comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. And the Minister of Defense said that if someone plans to hurt you or intends to harm you, you should harm them first and don't wait until they strike you. Those 2 expressions, besides their biblical background, throw us into a completely different doctrinary world, which in strategic terms is known as preemptive wars and the like. Either you need to assume that you know what the threat is. Do you know that your rival wants to destroy you? But we hear that there is a strong country that seeks to destroy us day and night. We'd like to see a better time. But if you take the decision without proof and you initiate a war of choice in order to preempt, strategically, that means that you must assess the intentions of the enemy much more clearly. Question if that was done. The burden on the intelligence becomes very, very heavy, too heavy, unbearably heavy. And if you adopt that doctrine, that's a doctrine that even the United States has not accepted, because that is a challenge that is more serious than all the other challenges that have been mentioned here. And it is a change that we have not been told about. David Ivry, I apologize for interrupting, but I think a directive in Gaza is not clear to the public, and when a directive is not clear, then the army doesn't know what to do either. It's clear to me that it's very difficult to have a directive in Gaza. And that's what I tried to explain, especially in the coalition. Everyone has their own point of view in the coalition, but that's the reality, and you need to see how you can have a directive to work with. The second thing is the directive in Syria. I think it's the right approach, and there's the right combination between policy and military. Everything is constantly being measured. And that's what I want to say. But take, for example, Operation Protective Edge and the other operations. We started with an excellent diplomatic situation. We had a lot of support, but after 4 days, the whole diplomatic approach started to change. If we had gotten out earlier, our situation would have been better. We have to always measure ourselves against the diplomatic. It's not the military achievement that counts. It's the diplomatic achievement that counts, and that must constantly be weighed. Thank you very much. I thank you all very much, and we will now vacate the stage for those who are not members of any of the challenging forums, and we will hear from the futurist, Professor David Pasig. He's an expert in predicting the future, and he will give us his approach on how to contend with the challenges of the future.
Hutstein. טוב, שלום רבותיי.
Good evening, everyone. I don't have a lot of time, but I just want to add another aspect that, in my opinion, humanity in general is at the verge of this stage when it comes to decision making. And in the state of Israel, we are just a bit behind other cultures. In general, it's very basic taxonomy of decision making take into consider intelligence information and other decisions that support that data based on academic filters and political filters and others. In my opinion, humanity, the decision making processes so far has operated based on a sense of history being meaningless. It's just one step after another without a beginning, a middle, or an end. But it is very possible that humanity is on the verge of a new era and new understanding of historical processes. And part of that is because of developing and emerging technologies. And what we are arguing is that there's logic in these systems. We are currently at a stage at which humanity is beginning to identify that there is logic in how historical processes develop. It's not only historical processes, it's financial processes, geopolitical processes, and others. And this is the additional layer that is lacking, in my opinion, in Israel. And the question is how we can add this layer to the decision-making process. It is clear that the decision-making process in Israel is very complicated, but I think that we can all agree that you and I are here not because the decisions have been made in a negative way throughout history, but because it has been very interesting. How do we incorporate this logic into the decision-making process? So first of all, this field is called prediction, but that's not necessarily what it's called around the world. It is called the theory of systems. We're trying to understand systems, the logic, and their patterns, especially to identify patterns so that we can understand the logic through the patterns and to add that layer, that extra aspect to decision making. Now we identify the logic based on several concepts that I'm sure are not new to you. I would like to focus now on how we add this aspect of understanding a system from the perspective of probable futures. How is that done? So we now have enough tools that we can use to clean the noise in the systems, especially historical systems, historical processes, and geopolitical processes. A lot of people have a feeling that geopolitical processes are just the chaos of self-interests and philosophies and ideology and characteristics, personal traits of different leaders. This field that is quantitative history is an attempt to focus, that is difficult for us to understand and to organize in a way that we can address challenges based on that information. I'll give you a few examples of how we can use software and knowledge of this kind in order to look back at and identify processes and understand their meaning, and to try to apply that forward and use it in the decision-making process. One of the nicest graphs that I'm familiar with from literature is this one that considers 2,000 years of wars in Asia. And let's see if there's any correlation with anything specific. This graph shows a very clear correlation with many different variables, especially the variable of values that the country has. It seems that the more a value becomes dominant in a certain country or region, then the level of hostility increases or decreases. Others try to use quantitative history to understand cycles of enhancement of different superpowers in countries. The source of most of this literature is Paul Kennedy, who found something very interesting about how the East and the West, time after time, they switch roles in leadership, in leading human production. I'm sure you can understand why I'm rushing through the slides. I really don't have a lot of time. One of the very interesting cycles that we've seen, and there's a lot of literature about this, there is a cycle of about 200-300 years in the history of the last few thousands of years. This is called the long wave cycle, and we can see it very in detail here, how enormous powers go through human history, appear and disappear, and then there are new powers, and then those disappear as well. Here you can quickly identify how we reach the modern era, where in the Enlightenment age, where we have a sense that everything's chaotic, but it is certainly possible that there's something much larger here that we haven't noticed. And if we do pay attention, we can incorporate this information in our decision-making processes. There are very large wave cycles, like financial cycles and social cycles and technological cycles. It's very interesting how they connect with one another and cause something to happen in history. Usually what happens is things that happen are related to hostilities between countries. So confrontations between countries is not something random that happens. It's not because of a certain ideology that comes up or another ideology that declines. There's so many variables that are intertwined, and we have enough tools today to at least understand the patterns. I'm sure you are all familiar with the contradict wave. It's very interesting. We can use it to identify stages, fascinating stages that almost every economic system follows, and it ends at the end of the cycle. There are confrontations. This is a function that very few people are familiar with. This very complex function can be used to predict how many casualties there will be in a future war. So if this is true, and we're at the verge of a new era in human history, when we are starting to dig through very enormous quantities of data in order to identify patterns. So far, the patterns seem very random, rather flat, because the human brain couldn't contain such enormous quantities of data. But today, because of the enormous computing power and databases, that humanity is creating, is collecting, we now have information to an extent that we never could have imagined beforehand. We can find patterns without even defining what kind of pattern we're looking for. It's what we call machine learning. Look at a pattern, a very simple pattern that identified how every 17 years the United States was at war over the last 200-300 years. When you see this pattern, you immediately realize that something is going to happen between 2018 and 2022. In Israel, there's also a pattern. We may not understand the logic, but there certainly is a pattern here. This is a pattern that has been with us for many, many years. And I am saying that I want to argue that even if we're aware of these patterns, we weren't aware of the logic behind these patterns. And what my argument is that we've reached the point where we can begin to identify the logic, why and how humanity finds itself over and over again, and social confrontations, violence. I did a little exercise not long ago. I took all of these the patterns that are familiar to us from the vast literature that is available and looks back thousands of years, and I wanted to see if they connect in any way. I was surprised to discover that about a decade ago I identified that they all meet up in 2018, between 2018 and 2020 as a pattern. This is something that we have to acknowledge. Not many people are involved in this field in Israel. It is very difficult for me to incorporate this type of thinking into the decision-making process. I am still considered a kind of strange, an oddball in the field, where we tend to feel like it all depends on who the leader is, the small self-interest, and the political the political structure at the moment, and the configuration at the specific meeting. But we haven't yet been able to understand that in the historical processes of humanity, there is an enormous vector that we're only just beginning to understand. So that we can hope to understand its significance. Many historians, many intellectuals do not agree with this conclusion, but many do agree with this conclusion. I'll just give you a few examples of books if you're interested, if you want to look into it, if you want to read more about this subject. A very popular a book that made waves in circles that I'm familiar with. I don't think that it's used often in decision-making processes. This is a very interesting woman. She is involved in decision-making related to international nuclear decisions, and she tried to identify patterns, and surprisingly enough, she identified a decision-making pattern patterns that led to world wars, and she showed how we are repeating the same patterns over and over again at the beginning of the 21st century. She wrote a fascinating book about this subject. There are other people that are more popular, more well-known, that also tried to find patterns. I want to make the following simple statement. In Israel, there have been incredible processes relating to decision-making under very difficult circumstances, based on a new evolving culture with many different types of thinking and different values. We've done incredible things, but we have to add another aspect and another layer to these processes. And in my opinion, it is not incorporated in the decision-making processes in Israel, and I hope that we will be able to incorporate it in the coming years. This book, thank you. I think that's enough. Thank you very much.